Welcome everyone. Happy Thursday, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to New Borders quarterly webinar on leveraging advanced analytics to enhance trade-based compliance and risk management. My name is Emma and I am from New Borders today. Thank you for your time. Next slide, please, Preeti. I think I'm going to start off with a slow roll. We have quite a few people joining actively as I am speaking, so I will slowly go through our agenda and introduce our participants. Oh, sorry, our panelists, not our participants. So my name is Emma. I'm the Senior Program Officer at New Borders. Thank you for joining us today. And just for everyone's awareness, this webinar is being recorded. However, as a participant or as an attendee, your video obviously and your name will not show up on this recording. So thank you. Here is our agenda for today. This webinar is hosted by New Borders and we'll have presentations from our partners from Page 4 Group, who will discuss Russia's dual-use commodity acquisitions and pivots that we might see as a result of global sanctions against Russia. Then the Siracusa International Institute will discuss the scope of EU sanctions enacted upon Russia post-Ukraine invasion. Then New Borders will bring it all together to discuss how the Business Intelligence for Trade Enforcement, or BITE platform, can be used to quickly adapt to global shifts as described by our presenters. The BITE platform allows for end users to leverage big data analytics and comb through millions of trade records to uncover trends and patterns, as well as red flag transactions. And then we will end with a short Q&A session. Next slide, please, Preeti. Thank you so much. So today we are joined by our partners from Page 4 Group in Serbia and Siracusa International Institute in Southern Italy. From Page 4 Group, we have Marko Radicic, and from Siracusa International Institute, we have Tobias Freeman. So Marko, would you like to introduce yourself now?
Yes, thank you, Emma. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our listeners today. I'm Marko Radojcic, the Managing Director of Page 4 Group. Page 4 Group was founded in 2019 and is based in Belgrade, Serbia. The Page 4 Group is focused on enhancing regional security and building law enforcement, security and safety capacities within Southeastern Europe and the Western Balkans. We're inspired by the Berlin Process Initiative for the Western Balkans and the Open Balkans Initiative, where we recognize the need for building partnerships. We partner with local, regional and global, private, non-governmental and governmental organizations in order to advise, collaborate and mentor organizations wishing to aid regional stability, security and safety in a sustainable way. We can move on to the next slide, please, Preeti.
Actually, Marko, I'm going to pause you and just have Tobias introduce himself first.
Cool thing.
Yes.
Thanks, Emma. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. My name is Tobias Freeman, and I'm Senior Legal Officer at the Siracusa Institute in Sicily. For those who don't know us, the Institute is an independent Italian law and policy organization that works in the fields of international criminal justice, human rights, and international cooperation, particularly against transnational crime. We're actually celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, 50 years of providing technical assistance to national institutions and intergovernmental bodies, providing training and education for criminal justice law enforcement officials, and carrying out research that currently focuses on transnational organized crime. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks so much, Tobias. And then today here from New Borders, we have my colleague, Mike Ronayne, former Homeland Security Special Agent and counterproliferation subject matter expert. And as mentioned before, I'm Emma, and I've been with New Borders for about 2.5 years. Next slide, please, Preeti. Thank you so much. So a brief background on New Borders. New Borders was formed in 2015 and consists of former Homeland Security personnel, IT experts, and customs enforcement subject matter experts. New Borders currently has contracts with the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, Department of State, and other civilian and federal agencies. We've also trained customs end users on the use of big data analytics in over 10 countries worldwide. So today we'll be discussing some background on the Russian situation from Marco and Tobias. And then we will discuss how the Byte platform can be used to leverage trade data for efficient trade compliance and risk analysis, particularly in relation to this situation in Russia. So thank you so much. Marco, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Emma. Today, I will present a very brief overview of the current situation regarding sanctions against the Russian Federation. Since March 2014, the European Union has progressively imposed restrictive measures, also known as sanctions, against Russia, initially in a response to the illegal annexation of the Crimea and Sevastopol regions of the Ukraine and the deliberate destabilization of Ukraine. On the 23rd of February 2022, the EU expanded the sanctions in response to the recognition of the non-government controlled areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts of Ukraine and the ordering of Russian armed forces into those areas. After the 24th of February 2022, in response to Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, the EU massively expanded the sanctions. It added a significant number of persons and entities to the sanctions list and adopted unprecedented measures with the aim of significantly weakening Russia's economic base, depriving it of critical technologies and markets, and significantly curtailing its ability to wage war. The respective EU Council regulations identified below are addressed to all persons, entities, and bodies under EU jurisdiction for which they create legal obligations. The EU has adopted 6 packages of sanctions in response to Russia's actions so far. The measures are designed to weaken the Kremlin's ability to finance the ongoing war, impose clear economic and political costs on Russia's political elite responsible for the invasion. The measures include the following: individual sanctions, economic sanctions, restrictions on Russian media outlets, and diplomatic measures. Economic sanctions have been extended successively for 6 months at a time since July 2016. The decision to extend them was made each time following an assessment of the implementation of the Minsk agreements. An example of sanctioned individuals include the Russian Federation's President, Vladimir Putin, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, the Speaker of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Maria Zakharova, members of the Russian State Duma, members of the National Security Council, military staff and high-ranking officials, business people and oligarchs, including Roman Abramovich, as one of the most popular or well-known oligarchs that I'm sure all of you know, individuals responsible for the atrocities committed in Bucha and Mariupol. This list is, however, not exhaustive, and there are hundreds of individuals on it. The measures were first introduced in March 2014. They were last extended until September 2022. Within the economic sanctions portion, I will briefly touch upon the sanctions in the defense area. These include the prohibition on exports to Russia of dual-use goods and technology items that could contribute to Russia's defense and security capabilities, and a prohibition on trade in arms. Due to the economic sanctions imposed in view of Russia's actions in Ukraine, the Russian military industry faces restrictions in acquiring dual-use items needed to fill in existing technological gaps. In order to circumvent the restrictions and avoid controls, Russia uses the services of intermediary companies established in the West and wholesalers in Russia to conceal the dual-use nature of the goods and their intended end use. Russia's military industry is likely to remain dependent on Western technologies in the near and medium term, so the need for intermediary services will remain high because of the restrictions applied upon Russia. To circumvent these restrictions, Russia exploits logistics operations throughout other transit countries. Logistics companies and other intermediaries responsible for the implementation of Russian orders organize the export of goods from or transit via both Russia's allies and adversaries. While conducting customs procedures, they often seek to conceal information about the dual-use nature of the exported goods and the actual end users in Russia. Such data must be submitted when applying for a license to export dual-use goods. Control authorities decide to grant a license after a thorough risk assessment and after making sure that dual-use items are not intended for use by the military or for military purposes as the end users. The end users of goods declared to the customs are often companies engaged in wholesale trade in Russia. In this way, transit countries become involved in obfuscated commodity delivery chains designed to circumvent international restrictions and to conceal real end users in Russia due to their links with the military industry. Production and sales of dual-use items come from manufacturers in the West. Sales and logistics intermediary companies established in the West obtain technologies and resell them to other intermediary companies, also known as a transshipment. Export from the West to Russia. During the procedures of customs exports, intermediary companies conceal the purpose of controlled dual-use items and the actual end users in Russia. The intermediate users in Russia are wholesale companies which sell technologies to science and education institutions implementing research programs, or to the representatives of the military industry and their entities, both overt and covert. Final military use in Russia entails final end users in Russia who use these technologies in the development programs of weapons of mass destruction or advanced conventional weapons. Moving on to the next slide. Here's an excerpt from a report of the Lithuanian State Security Department, the VSD. This is a very good example of a dual-use item that ended up in Russian military technology. Moving on to the next slide, please. Though the People's Republic of China has not imposed sanctions against Russia, nor has North Korea or any of Russia's southern neighboring states, Russia can also maintain railway links with its exclave of Kaliningrad, as per the latest EU guidelines. However, we predict that Russia will seek to diversify its trade links and not rely on China or any other single route. Here I will focus on the Caspian Basin, most notably Iran, which is experienced in sanctions evasion. There are a number of corridors, but the most notable one is the International North-South Transport Corridor, known as the INSTC, which is a roughly 10,000-mile long multi-mode network of ship, rail, and road routes for moving freight between India, Iran, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Russia, other Central Asian and European countries. The INSTC C-section and its coastal pillars are formed by a number of routes. The three most important ones shown here are the Trans-Caspian route, the corridor's west route, and the corridor's east route. Moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now we'll briefly give you an example of the entities in so-called sanction busting or sanctions evasion. The following companies are interested in projects related to electric power, water supply, and equipment manufacturing, considering that these are entities that provide critical infrastructure to Russian citizens. Russia has had to respond to Western sanctions and pivot to using the aforementioned alternate trade routes and partners to contribute to sustaining their economy. Here you have the examples and the names, former or current names of the best known or most active Russian entities which are engaged in sanctions evasion. Moving on to the next slide, please. Thank you. An issue that complicates matters is that certain entities, especially the US Treasury, have set a majority shareholder or ownership threshold. This is particularly important when it comes to sanctions against individuals, particularly oligarchs close to the current Russian regime. A good-to-go tool is linked above. It is the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which has a tool named the Russian Asset Tracker, which is very useful in following the assets that Russian oligarchs possess throughout the world, but most notably in Western countries. I will just briefly give an example of the following oligarch who is close to the current regime in Russia and is influential in the post-Soviet space. His name is Alisher Usmanov, who has been closely tied to top Russian leaders. However, his assets are hidden behind trusts, secretive offshore companies, Swiss bank accounts, and his family members, as well as non-family members, to detach his name from his billions. Usmanov maintains a 49% stake, just under the sanctions threshold, in his main business conglomerate. The remainder is held by a variety of secret offshore companies and business associates. Now you can imagine how difficult it is to track the real owners when it comes to imposing sanctions against individuals or particular entities. That would be my presentation for today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Marco. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Tobias for his portion.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Marco, for laying the ground so well. Today, I will firstly briefly touch on the path not taken, so international sanctions through the UN Security Council. Secondly, I want to explore briefly the interplay between EU-level decision-making processes when it comes to sanctions and the national sanctions regimes that do a lot of the heavy lifting. Thirdly, I'll mention a couple of developments in the way that certain EU member states approach sanctions. Although the EU has been on the front foot when it comes to sanctioning Russia, there is certainly room for greater harmonization at the regional level. If we could move to the next slide, please, Priti. The UN Security Council takes a two-pronged approach to international sanctions. A global approach in relation to issues that are of broad global concern, and a country-specific approach. According to either approach, UN sanctions effectively impose mandatory obligations on all UN member states as a matter of international law. In general, sanctions take effect through the adoption of resolutions which rest on its so-called Chapter 7 powers under the UN Charter, the foundational document of the UN organization, concerning particularly international peace and security. But this has not proven to be an effective route for sanctioning alleged perpetrators due to Russia's presence on the Security Council as one of its permanent 5 members, which can veto actions to be taken by the Council. So this fact has effectively paralyzed the Council in its duty to identify and address threats to international peace and security. At the EU level, the obligation to apply international sanctions is given effect by Council decisions and Council regulations of the EU Council. And these bind both EU member states, as well as all natural and legal persons within the EU, respectively. As a general note, regulations are among the strongest instruments of the EU legal order, and they've certainly played a decisive role in connection to EU actions taken against Russia and Belarus. Importantly, in relation to regulations, although they're adopted at the EU level, they are immediately enforceable as law within member states, and so they do not need to be transposed into national law in order to be effected. Relatedly, as an international standard-setting body in the fight against illicit financial flows, the Financial Action Task Force is also relevant to the extent that it develops specific requirements to give effect to and to implement relevant international sanctions. If we could move to the next slide, please. Since March 2014, the EU has progressively imposed so-called restrictive measures or sanctions on Russia in response to several key events, starting with the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. And Marco has given us some broader context to the Russia-specific sanctions. Who's calling the shots? Generally speaking, sanctions are decided by the Council of the European Union, which is constituted by the relevant ministers of each member state, depending on the matter under discussion. In this case, it's ministers of foreign affairs. And what has been agreed? Well, as Marco mentioned, the EU has imposed different types of sanctions, not just sanctions against individuals, but also sanctions targeting particular sectors of the Russian economy. Let's have a closer look at a couple of these types of sanctions. When it comes to individual sanctions, to date, more than 1,000 individuals and nearly 100 entities are subject to asset freezes or travel bans because their actions have undermined Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. The list of sanctioned persons and entities is kept under constant review, so it's also subject to periodic renewals by the Council. When it comes to economic sanctions, for the most part, these rest and build on foundational work carried out in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. And since the invasion this year, further sanctions have been introduced, now targeting the financial, trade, energy, transport, technology, and defense sectors of the Russian economy. Marco talked about the defense sector, but also in the energy sector and the transport sector, we see some relevant sanctions being introduced that target goods and technologies. So in the energy sector, there's the prohibition on exports to Russia of goods and technologies related to oil refining. And in the transport sector, we see prohibitions on exports of goods and technology in the aviation, maritime, and space industry. The main instruments concerning sanctions on Russia are the amended versions of a couple of different regulations. One dealing with actions undermining or threatening Ukraine's integrity, sovereignty, and independence. Another targeting Russia's actions, destabilizing the situation in the country. These instruments list the type of sanctions, the restricted goods, the individuals and legal persons that have been sanctioned, among other aspects. Two other noteworthy sanctions regimes establish restrictions on trade and investments with certain territories in Ukraine. So here we're talking about Crimea and Sevastopol on the one hand, following their illegal annexation in 2014, as well as another regulation dealing with restrictive measures after the recognition by Russia of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent territories and the ordering of Russian troops into those areas. If we could turn to the next slide, please, Priti. We've had a look at the broad nature of the measures introduced, but what was the process followed by EU leaders, especially since the invasion? Here we see a total of 6 packages, each with its own series of objectives, starting really from targeting individuals related to the decision taken by the Russian state to invade Ukraine. And progressively targeting certain sectors of the Russian economy, leading, of course, to perhaps the most widely reported targeting of Russian crude oil and refined petroleum products in early June this year. Could we move to the next slide, please, Priti? Taking a step back, the EU maintains a consolidated list of persons, groups, and entities. And here we've got some snapshots taken from the EU's Sanctions map, which is an online interactive tool. This tool is available for anyone to access online at sanctionsmap.eu. But the real star of the show is New Borders' Byte platform that you'll be introduced to shortly, an even more powerful and useful tool. We could turn to the next slide, please, Prithvi. So looking at the relationship between the EU as an international organization and its member states. Once sanctions have been adopted by the EU Council, Europe has a relatively integrated approach to implementation. But it's important to note that individual member states, not European entities per se, are chiefly responsible for implementation and enforcement, as well as the punishment of sanctions violations. In this context, there are some variations in the way that EU states tackle sanctions implementation. The Institute has been supporting New Borders by taking a look at some states in the Baltic area and Malta specifically. But it certainly would be interesting to take a closer and broader look at how EU states have reinforced their programs or not, especially this year. For example, until recently, and although the government is empowered to introduce sanctions on an autonomous basis, Estonia did not seem to maintain its own list of sanctions persons, relying instead on EU and UN sanctions lists to do the heavy lifting. But we saw in early February 2022, Estonia introduced a ban on Belarusian oil independently of the EU. Both Estonia and another country, Lithuania, also strengthened their legal frameworks this year. For instance, Estonia amended its Money Laundering Prevention Act and its International Sanctions Act, amendments that mainly clarified the interplay between the two instruments and streamlined national procedures for implementation. In both countries, the violation of EU sanctions can be either a criminal or an administrative offence, suggesting that it's a less serious offence. But this contrasts with several other countries across the Eurozone, such as Latvia, Malta, and many other EU states, where the violation of sanctions amounts to a criminal offence. Relatedly, the terms of imprisonment, as well as the imposition of fines, varies greatly across Europe. To talk a little bit more about the criminal or administrative offence distinction and its implications, most EU states categorise sanctions violation as a criminal offence. And based on an EU study, a region-wide study carried out some years ago, at least more than a dozen, in fact, states provide for the possibility that sanctions can be either criminal, sanctions violations could be criminal or administrative, depending on the gravity of the conduct. For example, under Lithuanian law, violations only amount to a criminal offence if they cause major damage to the Republic of Lithuania. When sanctions violations are a crime under national law, the period of imprisonment ranges greatly. So it ranges from 6 months to 20 years. In most states, however, the maximum period of imprisonment is between 2 and 5 years, so significantly below that maximum threshold. Against this backdrop, it's worth mentioning that the European Commission has proposed that the violation of EU sanctions be added to the crimes listed in EU's foundational treaty, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. This provision, Article 83(1), allows for the establishment of minimum rules at the EU level for the definition and the sanctioning of particular criminal offences. So this provides for greater harmonisation across Europe. I note that this list already includes crimes such as terrorism, human trafficking, money laundering and corruption, among other offences often related to organised crime. In addition to criminalisation and the punishment of violations by imprisonment as well as pecuniary fines, the laws and regulations of many states foresee additional measures can be taken, such as the forfeiture of property and assets. Additionally, the approval, license, or authorization necessary to conduct certain business activities can also be suspended or withdrawn in most states. These additional measures mostly aim at targeting the profits gained from the violation of restrictive measures, or restraining specific companies or business actors from engaging in further violations. So just to conclude, in response to Russia's invasion, there has been a rapid evolution in the sanctions landscape in Europe. Regulations have been an important tool for this, and they are directly enforceable in EU member states. The fact that this change was led by EU institutions can be explained by the nature of the Union and its integrated approach to EU sanctions. It's an international organization with a unique level of integration between the national and the supranational levels. EU countries are intimately linked, whether it's politically, economically, or even institutionally, both to EU institutions as well as to other member states. And it's worth mentioning that together they form the largest economy in the world. The European Commission's leadership has been commendable, but EU sanctions can only do so much. So we should also be clear-eyed about the fact that the majority of the world's population lives in countries that do not comply with the same sanctions. In other words, one national regulator's commitment to uphold sanctions in the face of Russian aggression looks quite different from the perspective of an African nation needing to secure oil to keep the lights on, or enough grain to prevent mass starvation. Instituting sanctions at the same time, that's one thing, but assessing their effectiveness is another. The effectiveness of international sanctions and their capability to achieve particular political, economic, or even military objectives are notoriously difficult to discern. And this is particularly the case when sanctions are not uniformly adopted by all countries around the world, which at the best of times is a big ask. Finally, I might finish on this. The violation of EU sanctions is punishable in member states, depending on the national legal frameworks in question. But there's significant room for greater harmonization and attention also to the enforcement of sanctions in practice. For these reasons, the European Commission's proposal to lift the standard in terms of criminalization is a space that we should watch in the coming months. I'll hand back to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Tobias and Marco. So Preeti, yeah, we can move to the next slide. So this is great. So thank you again, Tobias and Marco, for your very, very interesting and informative presentations. And now that we've heard about this particular problem set laid out nicely by Tobias and Marco, we would like to discuss some of the tools that are available. So Russia's invasion into Ukraine has produced an abundance of global sanctions, creating compliance challenges faced by the global trade community. So it's important to have a variety of tools available to help with the enforcement and trade, to help the enforcement and trade communities quickly pivot and adapt to remain compliant and informed. Next slide. So what are the tools available to the trade community and to governments to identify potentially illicit trade transactions involving sanctioned entities? So New Borders has developed an approach, the BITE platform, as we've mentioned previously a few times. The BITE platform leverages trade data in combination with other various data sets. As you can see in this slide, quite a few different data sets. BITE can be used to quickly segregate anomalous or red flag transactions in large volumes of trade data based on tailored problem sets. So in this slide, you can see there are quite a few different problem sets that BITE can assist with an approach to. So in BITE, end users can address their specific compliance needs, track cases or trade patterns within the supply chain. A user can request a risk analysis to be performed on a select transaction, a company, or an individual of interest, all in one platform. So using advanced analytics, end users are able to identify sanctioned entities or denied parties, or the movement of specific commodities, such as commodities that contribute to nuclear proliferation, or another example, the movement of petrol to and from Russia, which is of particular interest at this moment, as well as items that are produced through forced labor, which is again, another area of interest at the moment. Next slide, please. So here we have a high-level architecture platform visual that captures what the BITE platform looks like from the back end. So Byte is both a web-based application and an analytical platform, and it includes the analytics platform with the ability to upload and analyze trade transactions, as I've mentioned before. Byte Workflow, a case management tool to manage compliance cases and request a trade assessment from our experts. Byte includes the ability to search against multiple international watch lists, US import data, other international manifest data sets, sensitive harmonized tariff code filters, and safe trade lists. Byte also includes an API data feed, which connects your system and data to our screening lists to flag for transactions of interest in your supply chain. And lastly, Byte training courses are housed on the Byte platform. These are delivered by our experts on how to leverage Byte's analytical tools for best practices and to augment your compliance functions. So next slide, please. So here quickly, I wanted to walk you through a problem set, or rather an example of how our team used Byte recently in relation to this problem set that Tobias and Marco discussed. So as mentioned, the EU recently published a number of sanctions packages against Russian entities, as well as individuals such as Vladimir Putin or other oligarchs, Russian oligarchs. So the US has also published a number of comprehensive packages of sanctions in response to the February invasion of Ukraine. So our team took on a project to analyze Russian manifest data and capture a high-level trade behavior pattern, or the high-level trade behavior patterns of sanctioned Russian oligarchs and their businesses. So this is simply an example of how Byte can quickly segregate specific trade elements in manifest data and provide us with easily visualizable patterns. So to initiate this analysis, our subject matter expert, Mike Ronayne, used open source information to identify over 60 Russian oligarchs and their recently sanctioned family members, as well as over 70 affiliated businesses that were associated with these oligarchs. So then our data science team created a filter based on Mike's research and applied it to the Russian trade data that we had housed in the Byte platform. So next slide, please, Preeti. And here you can see, this was the summary or the takeaway, the visuals that we captured and created in the Byte platform relating to the oligarch affiliated business trade patterns. So there were over 170,000 unique trade transactions that were affiliated with these businesses. And our most noteworthy takeaway in this particular example was that the oligarch affiliated business exports, so the transactions that were leaving Russia, accounted for significantly less of the total transactions. So only about 15,000 transactions were oligarch affiliated and were leaving Russia to another country. So they were exports. But the aggregate value of these export transactions was over 15 times that of the import value of aggregate value. So that total was 74 billion US dollars. And as you can see from these graphs, we determined that about half or way more than half of these exports contain petrol. And that was according to the HS code, and they were going to Ukraine. So here we just use this particular example to capture the high level trade pattern that Byte is able to help us produce and help us determine. But Byte can for sure go deeper and help us to capture a more granular analysis, even at the entity level. So that really wraps it up. Preeti, you can go to the next slide. So that really wraps up our webinar for today. However, we wanted to give you a chance to ask any questions that you might have. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, or to raise your hand and we can let you speak. And then before you leave, we also wanted to provide you with our contact information. So byte@newborders.com for more information on Byte or free access to a trial of Byte, as well as this PowerPoint. We'll send you a copy of this PowerPoint. And then lastly, but not least, Our partner contact information for Marco and Tobias are on this slide as well. And so I'm going to step back and allow everyone to turn their cameras back on and see if we have any questions, if anybody has any comments, questions, or otherwise.